Today I'm going to try to draw this spruce tree in Kadriorg Park in Tallinn, Estonia, and as I'm inclined to do with subjects like this one, I'm starting at the top and working my way down. I've spoken at length about the benefits of this approach, as you well know if you've watched a few of my videos, so I won't rehash all of that yet again, but one thing I would like to point out is that by starting at the top with a subject like this, that is something organic and generally open to interpretation, I can kind of land on the correct proportions by simply stopping when it feels right. In contrast, a building, for instance, would bind me to much more specific proportions that coincide with a number of other components like doors and windows and whatnot. So here, I'm free to interpret this overall shape to my liking, and when I think it looks about right, when I feel I've reached the bottom, I can go ahead and call it there. I can decide that I've reached the bottom, which is exactly what I'll be doing. In fact, for the most part, I finish what I'm working on before I move down. So I'm not building out the full scene. I'm not sketching in the silhouette of the tree. I'm slowly, methodically following the tree down, focusing on the types of shapes I see along the way. I'm not concerned with copying this exactly. You know full well I'm not capable of that anyway, but I'm using bits and pieces of the tree to inform some of the decisions I make on the paper. So as I look up to observe the tree, I'm noticing specific branches and how they fall, as well as small clumps where there might be a lot of overlap, which would produce areas with more shadow. This process is pretty constant for me today. You might notice me shifting around quite a bit. That's me looking up and down, and that's why. I'm basically taking notes in my head. I'm observing where I feel that I am on the tree, picking up certain things and dropping them into the drawing. Also, while this reference makes for a beautiful scene, I don't treat it as such. I would have loved to, don't get me wrong, but every now and then, as you know, I want to try to concentrate on a singular subject. In this case, the tree in the middle gets my undivided attention. It's not always easy to find small, visually appealing references to both draw and film, but I've come to realize that a broader scene like this one contains within it a multitude of singular subjects. I've been so preoccupied with finding individual things, like objects for me to draw, but it's only recently that I've started to kind of ignore the majority of a reference for the sake of just a piece of it. So that's what I'm doing here today. This tree might as well be a skyscraper or the tip of a pencil, and the details are what will differentiate them. All of that probably sounds super duper obvious from the outside, but what can I say? I'm only 60 days into figuring this stuff out, so it's all pretty new to me. Anyway, while I was drawing this tree in this park, which, like I said a few days ago, is one of my favorite spots in all of Tallinn, I was feeling particularly good. Today wasn't the nicest day weather-wise. It was kind of overcast and chilly. The wind gusts were pretty consistent, but for whatever reason, it all just felt right. Before this, my wife and I grabbed a coffee from a little place down the road, took a slow walk over to and through the park, looking for things to draw, but also having a nice conversation. There weren't many people out, which made things calm and quiet, although this area is never really all that busy. And to my delight, I wasn't feeling overly picky today, so stumbling upon this reference was kind of a breeze. Everything went off without a hitch, and that gave me space to appreciate it. It got me thinking about how fulfilling this project has been, and also about how I just love being outside in nature. I love parks, I love gardens, I love the coast, but something I haven't yet experienced from the drawing perspective is some of the more rugged, mountainous areas that I also love. Of course, hauling my materials to and through the local garden is simple, to say the least, and I wonder what that'll be like on a hike. Part of me thinks that I'll feel like I can't be bothered, like the height should be just that, and I shouldn't make it about the drawings. But another part of me recognizes just how much I'm enjoying this and how exciting it could be to make some in and of the mountains. Drawing in cities is a much different experience to drawing in nature, and I think that really hit me for the first time when we left Jeju Island, which, if you don't know, is where all of this started. I do enjoy drawing in town, especially here. Tallinn is magical, but the feeling is completely different. For the most part, I've gotten used to people walking past or lingering or making comments. So it's not as much that as it is just finding the ideal combinations of requirements. So, for example, obviously I'm looking for things to draw that also translate well to video, but that relies on other things, creative things like lighting and colors and movement, if there is any. But there's also the logistical stuff, which consists of where to set up the tripod, like for the reference video, where to sit and draw to ensure that the lighting works and that I'm not in the way. And that stuff is largely inconsequential in some of these more natural areas. There's usually a lot more open space, making things generally simpler, and that simplicity tends to beget an enjoyable drawing experience. That doesn't always mean the drawings themselves will be good, but at least I'm having a nice time doing it. In the coming months, I'll be in some locations where I can really put this to the test, and I'm pretty excited to see how it goes. Actually, I'm just excited for variety, period. That's why I think, or that's one of the reasons why I think this learning to draw experience has been and will continue to be so fulfilling. It's not just the drawings, but also where they take me, and I think that's pretty cool. With that, I've been thinking a lot about the relationship between skill and enjoyment. There must be some correlation because the more things one can draw and the better they do so, I'd imagine the more fun they would have. Obviously, that's not taking into account things like expectation or the Dunning-Kruger ridiculousness. So if we set that stuff aside and just look at the raw experience of sitting down to draw, I would think that being better would increase enjoyment. I don't have any data to support that, but I do have some anecdotal evidence, at least as it concerns the opposite. While I've gone on and on about having a nice time and feeling fulfilled and all that, there's still this significant weight of inexperience that bears down on me and holds me back from making what I wish I could. I'm pursuing this so that I can relinquish myself of that weight. But in the interim, it's a noticeable hindrance to my abilities, which does have an effect on how fun it is. Thankfully, I've made this process public, thankfully, I guess, which helps a lot in keeping myself consistent, but that certainly doesn't mean I'm always having a good time. And while increasing my skill level won't totally ameliorate that, I'm sure it wouldn't hurt. The point is, if you happen to be in a similar situation, and it doesn't have to be drawing, it could be any new to you thing, I'm here to say that this is not always a grand old time. I'm not out here skipping through town and frolicking through the forest. Sometimes this is the last thing in the world that I want to do. Once again, it's fortunate that I decided to make this something bigger than simply learning to draw in my free time. It keeps me accountable, that's for sure. But even still, all of my overt limitations, which we all get to see in action on a daily basis, prevent me from making what I'd like to be making. And sometimes that can be disheartening. However, and there's always a however, by observing the macro over the micro, I can see that some of those limitations have fallen away. The weight of an experience becomes lighter by the day, but not enough to perceive in the moment. It's only by looking back, by honestly comparing where I was to where I am, that I can notice and appreciate how far I've come. It's not always easy to see it that way. It's never easy, but it's important, like I said, to just see it honestly. Of course, I'm not going to make big strides from yesterday to today, but maybe from last week or last month, who knows? It's just about seeing it from the appropriate perspective. So again, if you happen to be in the same boat, or if you're considering jumping aboard, just know that it isn't always going to be fun. But that's also not what this is all about. Sure, fun is great, but seeking something fulfilling isn't always strictly fun. Nevertheless, there will be fun to be had, but maybe it'll take a little bit longer to get to the really good stuff. Fingers crossed we get there eventually. Okay, so as you no doubt noticed, I haven't said much about the drawing, and that's because it's all pretty much the same thing all the way down. We took a significant detour today, I'm aware, but hey, if you're still watching, that's what really matters. I hope you're having as good a time as I am. That said, before we finish up, let's talk a little bit about some of the things I did here. So first, I wanted to draw this as realistically as I could manage. When I sat down to edit this, I was curious to see how some other people would approach a tree like this one. And as you can imagine, there were innumerable approaches from the super beginner, like symbols of a tree, all the way up to hyper realistic, practically photographic renditions of a tree. And mine falls obviously somewhere in the middle. I'm clearly not approaching this as like a tall triangle with some furry bits, nor am I taking 3 weeks to render each and every twig. So I don't know where along that scale I would sit, but it's interesting to see just how broad a spectrum it can be. Second, speaking more practically, I noticed that the top part of the tree was a lot more sparse than the bottom, so I tried to leave some space between the branches, and as I worked my way down, I'd progressively fill those in. I also noticed that the trunk of the tree could be seen intermittently from bottom to top, so I made sure to leave room for it along the way. I had the most trouble with the branches that face directly toward me, but I realized that those areas would catch the most light from my perspective, so I used some negative space to imply them. This is strange in practice. It's really hard to visualize that as I'm doing it, but I think it looks okay in the final drawing. And lastly, as much as I wanted to really draw the shapes of all of these individual branches, I constantly reminded myself that I should be subtle first, and if necessary, I could go back and add more later. I knew I'd risk exaggerating them if I focused too intently, so I did my best to kind of unfocus and approach the whole thing through more ambiguous shapes, as well as contrast, adding specific details in small ways here and there, and only when I thought the rest of a given area was adequately fleshed out. So here we have it, a tree. If you remember the last time I drew a tree, just a tree, that is, it was not like this. I think I've come a long way since then, or maybe it's just a nice day, or maybe it's just this miraculous pen I've been using. Whatever the case, I'm interested to hear what you think about it, so let me know in the comments. Also, if you have any thoughts about any of the other stuff I said, I'd love to hear that as well. Anyway, I appreciate you, as always, for taking the time to watch this one, and I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks.